This is Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. And now your host, Michael O'Fallon.
We are being transitioned from a closed society into an egalitarian, open culturally, open society. But it is important to understand that what will be purported to be an open society is really the most closed society in the history of mankind, as mankind begins to transition into something else. But it is important to see clearly what is happening in Western civilization today. It is vital that you see the events around you from a mountaintop view, from a satellite view, if you will. Being able to see what is being done to your nation and also why it is being done, as our nation is being put through a process of ideological, religious, and ethnic fracturing and ghettoization. Lines are being blurred, including the blurring of lines between national borders. And when national borders are blurred, it also means that the social contracts that define those nations are blurred. And when those social contracts are blurred, particularly in the United States, where our Constitution and the laws that flow from that Constitution are being basically ignored, then you are left with some sense of lawlessness. Especially when you have calls to defund the police, or when you have mayors in cities like Minneapolis or Philadelphia who remove law enforcement officers and replace them with safety officers, because the new safety officers are not present in the community to enforce the law. They are present in the community to make it a safe place. And so, where there is no enforcement of the law, then there is no law. And where there is no law and no law enforcement, it will create a vacuum. A desolate, empty, non-enforceable community without the social contract of the United States, the Constitution, being enforced and guaranteeing that the rights of the citizens against unreasonable search, the rights of the citizens of free speech, the rights of the citizens to be able to worship as their conscience dictates, or not to worship in the fashion that the state dictates. There is an emptiness, a void that has been created. And in many communities across the United States and Europe, where there are many ethnically Chinese residents, both full citizens of the United States and as well those that are Chinese visitors, well, there are now Communist Chinese Party police stations being set up in other nations. Nations outside of the Chinese Communist Party. Like our nation. Because borders don't matter anymore. China has set up at least 54 overseas police stations in 30 countries, including in the United States, Canada, Spain, Italy, France, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Hungary, Portugal, the Czech Republic, Brazil, Argentina, and Nigeria. This is according to a recent report from Safeguard Defenders, a human rights NGO. The police stations are part of China's campaign to persuade Chinese citizens who are suspected of criminal acts against China to stop, particularly telecommunications fraud, but also political crimes such as political dissent against China, to return to China to face criminal prosecution. China not only threatens the Chinese citizens themselves, but also members of their families who have stayed behind in China. Now, these kind of threats have been continuing for years, as FBI Director Christopher Wray pointed out in 2020, when he mentioned a case from the U.S. in which a Chinese government emissary visited a target in the United States and told him that he could choose between returning to China or committing suicide. So according to the anti-communist Chinese Party organization, Safeguard Defenders, quote, China's overseas police stations purport merely to have administrative or consular functions, but function as means of threatening Chinese abroad to return to China, thereby skipping the necessary legal requirements under international law. End quote. And Safeguard Defenders continues by saying the following, quote, these methods allow the CCP and their security organs to circumvent normal bilateral mechanisms of police and judicial cooperation, thereby severely undermining the international rule of law and territorial integrity of the third countries involved. In eschewing regular cooperation mechanisms, the CCP manages to avoid the growing scrutiny of its human rights record and the ensuing difficulties faced in obtaining the return of fugitives through legal proceedings such as formal extradition requests. It leaves legal Chinese residents abroad fully exposed to extra-legal targeting by the Chinese police, with little to none of the protection theoretically ensured under both national and international law. Now, these stations are openly labeled as overseas police service stations, for example, for renewing Chinese driver's licenses remotely and other tasks traditionally considered of a consular nature. But the stations also serve a more sinister goal, as they contribute to resolutely cracking down on all kinds of legal and illegal criminal activities involving overseas Chinese, end quote. So, the communist Chinese police stations are obviously also used to target Chinese abroad who disagree with the regime. Safeguard Defenders continues by saying this, quote, one of the aims of these campaigns, obviously, as it is to crack down on dissent, is to silence people. So people are afraid. People that are being targeted, that have family members back in China, well, they're afraid to speak out. End quote. So the police stations operate without the consent and knowledge of their host countries. And what they do is they demand silence, or else. They open in other countries outside of the United States, such as the Netherlands, where one of the police stations operates out of a plain ground floor apartment in Rotterdam, belonging to a small Chinese handyman business. Several countries, such as Canada, the Netherlands, the UK, Portugal, and Spain, are now investigating the matter, and some of these have already demanded the closures of the Chinese overseas police stations on their soil. Dutch Foreign Minister Wopke Hoekstra wrote on Twitter, quote, we have asked the Chinese ambassador for full clarification on the so-called police stations carrying out tasks in the Netherlands on behalf of the Chinese government. As no permission was sought from the Netherlands for this, the ministry has informed the ambassador that the stations must close immediately. In addition, the Netherlands itself is also investigating the stations to find out their exact activities, end quote. And in the United States, as we had referred to before, FBI Director Christopher Wray said that the FBI was investigating the matter. Yes, Chris Wray was, I'm sure, to the task after he spent time on Twitter. But anyway, he says this, quote, we are aware of the existence of these stations. To me, it's outrageous to think that the Chinese police would attempt to set up shop, in New York, let's say, without proper coordination. It violates sovereignty and circumvents standard judicial and law enforcement cooperation processes, end quote. Wray added that the FBI was, quote, looking into the legal parameters and stated that the FBI has opened charges related to Chinese government harassment, stalking, monitoring, and blackmailing Chinese in the U.S. who were critical of China's President Xi Jinping. He said, quote, it's a real problem and something that we're talking with our foreign partners about as well, because we're not the only country where this has occurred, end quote. Boy, doesn't FBI Director Chris Wray sound really concerned about the possibility of the communist Chinese government setting up law enforcement measures within the borders of the United States. No, Christopher Wray is more concerned about moms who want to clear Marxists out of their schools. Chris Wray wants to call those moms terrorists, while allowing the Marxists to continue teaching their children. So what makes you think that Chris Wray is concerned about Marxists running law enforcement efforts across the United States? He isn't concerned. He's too involved with telling Twitter who they should deplatform, and even more so when you start looking into Facebook, too. Well, he's not concerned, and neither is anyone else, because we have entered a giant open society, which soon will be a very, very closed society. But for now, it's an open society that doesn't have a problem with someone who is a citizen of China voting in U.S. elections. An open society which is assisting with allowing critical immigration practice to run unabated on our borders at the tune of 15,000 immigrants a day. In other words, a group of unknown, unvetted immigrants which add up to a town the size of Williamsburg, Virginia, enters the United States every day, because there is no law enforcement at the border. But the Chinese Communist Party is allowed to operate their own police stations in the United States. The United States government has been allowing this to happen. State and local governments are allowing this to happen because they are now global citizens. And in reality, they are members of the new totalitarian state. Ladies and gentlemen, citizens of the United States, and as well, those of you that are citizens in the UK that are listening, citizens that I know in France and Germany and Italy, we must return the United States to a nation of law and order. We must return to a nation that enforces the Constitution. We must respect private property. We must continue with our operation of the nation on oil and gas. We must reject the globalist attempt to fracture our nation. We must come together as a nation. We must convince and plead with our fellow Americans to value liberty and freedom. And we must openly mock and deride the totalitarians, because time is running out. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had communist Chinese police stations in the United States. Start standing up for the Constitution. Start demanding that law enforcement enforce the laws of the United States. And start demanding that members of your church, citizens in your town or county, get involved. This is the United States of America. God has shed his grace on thee. And it is our responsibility to defend this great nation, not to run from it, not to balkanize it. And it is your responsibility to stand for the Constitution, to stand for your fellow man. Because if you won't fight for it, we will lose it. And we can't lose. We must win. I'm Michael O'Fallon, and this has been Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic.